Salve omnes and welcome to this week's video tutorial. Your first exam will be next week, which I will explain in an email. Today we're going to talk about the longer passage in chapter 21. So if you have your books, please open them to page 173. As always, we'll need to familiarize ourselves with the vocabulary using the learning vocabulary in the chapter, the dictionary and/or Whitaker's Words, which I have queued up for us as well. This is a passage from Virgil's Eclogues, which is a long epic poem. His most famous work, as you may know, is called the Aeneid, which is considered Rome's and Latin's great national epic. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. This text, we can say by noting its title, it's Messianic Eclogue. This text has been interpreted variously as predicting the coming of Christ, as well as subject to another number of other interesting interpretations, which this format doesn't allow us to delve into, but which in your own study of literature and literary history you're sure to come across. Venitiam magnae aetes novae de caelo mititur puer qui vitam de orum habebit Deus videbit et ipse vedibitur abilis. Hic puer regit mundum cui virtutes patris pacem dederunt, pauca male autem remanebunt quae homines iubibunt laborare atque bellum asperum gerere. Erunt etiam altera bella atque itrum a Troia magnus mititur Achilles. Tum pure ubi iam longa aetes te virum fecerit, erunt nulle labores nulla bella, nautae ex navibus discedent, agricolae quoque iam agros relinquent, terra ipsa omnibus, hominibus omnia parebit, currite aetetes cincipe parve pur scire matram et erizati spiritus mihi tua dicere facta. So, starts off with the verb venit, which means comes. Think of Advent, like an Advent calendar. So comes, now, great, age, new. This is the main noun here. I pulled it up on Whitaker's Words for us. You can see this is a third declension noun. It means lifetime, age, generation, period. So we're going to go with age in this particular context. So we put all together is that now comes a great new age. So I'm going to go ahead and write that down here. Just elaborating a bit, this verb is in the third person singular, as mentioned, agreeing with age. Yam is just an adverb meaning now. And then we have our two adjectives, namely magna, nova. The reason they are feminine endings is because if we look at Whitaker's Words, we can see this is a feminine noun. So we're going to need the first declension feminine ending in the nominative nova magna to agree with that noun. For a masculine, for example, then it would be us. But since age is feminine, then we add the a for that particular instance. De caelo, we've seen de many times. That's a preposition. It means from or concerning. In this case, probably from. It's always followed by the ablative. So sure enough, caelo, which is a second declension neuter noun, second declension ablative singular is o. So de caelo means from the sky or from the heavens. So let's go ahead and write that down. A boy is being sent. So here's our restur munmini nuntur. So this is our passive voice. So as always, if we just look this up, if we don't remember, this is our present passive indicative. So is being sent, is thrown, is hurled, is cast. So I'm going to say is sent or is being sent. Of course, English does not prefer passive stylistically, but since we're doing Latin, not English, we can keep it literal if we want. If you want to say is sent, that's fine too. So from the heavens, a boy is sent. And then here we have a relative pronoun going back to chapter 17. Who, we need to be able to recognize that our verb is in the future tense, bo be be boo. Who will have the life of the gods. So deorum is second declension genitive plural. So there's our genitive plural, orum deorum. So let's go ahead and write that down. From the heavens, a boy is sent. I want to keep it lowercase since we're doing classical mythology, not Christian thought. A boy is being sent who will have the life of the gods. We should be able to recognize this as the direct object. So if we look at our declension endings, here's first declension accusative singular, vitam deorum, the life of the gods. Vita, of course, is where we get words such as vital, vitality, and the like, meaning life in Latin. Who will have the life of the gods will see the gods. So here, this is nice because here we have it in the genitive plural. Here we have it in the accusative plural, which means here it's the direct object. But then our bo be boo, who will see the gods. Let's go ahead and write that down as well. Who will have the life of the gods, who will see the gods, and he himself will be seen by them. Let me write that down and then I'll explain the grammar for that one. Et, of course, means and. Ipse is a reflexive pronoun, so he himself. Again, we have our bo be boo, so it's future, but it's future passive because we have the tur, because aris tur moving into our passive endings. And then ab illis is referring back to the gods. From them, or will be seen in himself. He will be seen. He himself will be seen by them. So since it's by them and it's gods, this is going to be second declension ablative plural, which is is ab illis. So by them, based on context, referring back to the gods. Pronouns can be tricky in Latin, only context clues, but hopefully we recognize this is in the ablative plural. Hic puer, this boy. This we need to recognize. So the bo be boo is future tense for first and second conjugation, but regere is a third conjugation. Once again, only careful mastery of vocabulary or looking up words is going to help us learn that. But you can see I looked it up on Whitaker's. So it's future active, so we need to say will rule, not some other tense. And then mundum is our accusative direct object. So if we look at our declension chart, mundum, so he will rule the world. In fact, let's go ahead and write that down. Again, this can be variously interpreted as a homage to Caesar Augustus. As I mentioned, some Christian writers have it interpreted as a prophecy describing the coming of Christ. For our purposes, either of those interpretations would make sense, including some others that we can't go into. But hopefully we recognize the grammar. He will rule the world. So this boy will rule the world. In which, so this could mean that the cui is a little bit tricky here because cui is, going back to chapter 17, This is a pronoun in the dative case. So it's either to which or to whom or in which. This one's a little bit tricky. I think it's referring back to world in this case. So we're going to say in which the virtues of his father had given peace. Let me write that out and then I'll try to explain that. But this clause is a little bit tricky. In fact, maybe to which makes sense. To which let's take a look at this in a little bit greater detail, since adjective clauses or relative clauses can be tricky in Latin. So we started off by saying this boy, hic puer, will rule the world. So we can put maybe a backslash here to distinguish that. But then cui, once again, if we don't recall this, we'll have to go back and look at chapter 17. But you can see the challenge that even using Whitaker's words, it has all kinds of possible meanings. And then the trick, or the difficult part, if you will, is try to find the antecedent. Just like in English, if we use who, that, which, or what, we sort of know based on context what this pronoun is referring to. Latin is the same thing, but since it's a foreign language, it's a little less intuitive, hence a little bit trickier. But I think in this case, it's referring back to the boy. And then to whom the virtues of his father. So virtues is third declension. So third declension accusative plural is is. So that makes it the direct object. You see I'm toggling over that right now. But then of his father, that's singular patris. So we have virtutis patris, to whom the virtues of his father. Remember, Latin tends not to use possessive adjectives or his, her, mine, your, their, and so forth. So we have to add that in our translation to make it idiomatic English. So to whom the virtues of his father had given peace. We need to be able to recognize this as the pluperfect or past perfect, because we have the erunt, but then we have the date here. So if we look this up here and put this in our Whitaker's words, no, actually this is just regular present active, so has given peace or gave peace would also work in this case. So let me change that slightly here. So to has given peace. This, as you may recall, is one of the first verbs introduced in the Wheelocks, going back to chapter 1. You can see it's do, dare, dati, datus. And so if you go back to chapter 1, you'll see the do was one of the first one, but here we're just using it in a more advanced tense, namely the perfect tense. And then peace, we should be able to recognize that also, since I have the Whitaker's words out. You can see that's pak pakis, but since it's pakem, that tells us it's third declension accusative singular, which makes it the direct object, as you'll see. So here, pakem accusative singular, and then we just verify that with our chart. There's pakem. So put it all together is to which he will rule the world. In fact, I'm going to change that one more time here. He will rule the world, to whom the virtues of his father, I need a subject verb agreement, have given peace. All right, so that one's a tricky one right here. I think the first part's prettier, but this clause right here, quia virtutis patris pacem dederunt, is a little bit tricky. Auta means however or but, and then here we have a neuter noun, but a few evils will remain. So there's our bo be be boo. So if we look up remanebant, we're going to see that is in the future tense. Sure enough, future active, so will remain. Mala also is a neuter noun. Again, we can verify that. Of course, this doesn't help us too much, but it is a neuter noun, so we get words like malicious or maleficent. So we put it all together is but a few evils will remain. but a few evils will remain, which, so here is a little bit easier personal pronoun, which will order men, or literally which will order human beings. I'm going to say which will order men. Quai, referring back to the male. Bo bi 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 boo, and ubio means to order. I think this is a verb we had earlier in the course in a previous semester. Which will order men. Notice homines is third declension, accusative plural. These can be tricky because we also have is here, but the context tells us that it's being used, or functions rather, as the direct object. So, but a few evils will remain. If you want to say that will order men, that's fine too. And then order them what? We'll order them to work. So here's simply our infinitive, laborare. So that's our infinitive we've had before, which will order men to work, literally to labor. And also to wage a difficult war. So let me write that out, then I'll explain that in greater detail. And also to wage or to carry out. The context of this in the context of Rome would be after the civil wars and after the ascension of Caesar Augustus. Rome still had a lot of work to do to rebuild its social fabric. And that could be a reference to that. So even though the civil wars were over, nevertheless, it was still an important task of rebuilding, a lot of work to rebuild the discarded, disbanded social fibers that Rome had suffered in civil wars the past century. Yeah, just let me comment on this briefly. To wage, that is simply get erre and then aspera, where we get the word aspergium or asperity. That is the adjective here. We have the neuter ending, asperum bellum. You may recall that Latin likes to put the adjectives after the noun. So this actually is the adjective here. And this is the noun. As always, we can look it up in our dictionary, but Whitaker's Words is more convenient many times. So let's just look that up here just to give us a little bit of confidence. Asperum, harsh, land, difficult. If you want to say harsh war, that's fine too, or rough. I think I said difficult, but kind of the same sense, I believe. Atque means and also. Erront, this can be tricky to identify in my experience. This is the future tense. There will be. So it looks like it has the perfect ending. It does, but in this case, it's actually the verb there will be. So it's future active, as you can see. So let's go ahead and write that down because this one can be difficult in my experience. So there will be. Another good example how Latin uses a lot less words. I think that's one of the more challenging parts in Latin. Latin is very periphrastic, and one word in Latin can mean 3 words in English in this particular instance. And because it feels like we're often missing something, that is where Latin requires a little bit of analysis and imagination and just learning the grammar and all the other things in order to make sense of the language. So there will also be, so ete means also, other wars. So altera bella means other wars. So there will also be as you may know, that Rome was in one sense always at war. So this trope of there being other wars is certainly not new in Roman history, but that is what's going on there. So there will also be other wars, and again, a great Achilles will be sent to Troy. So let me go ahead and write that down, and then I'll try to explain that in further detail. And again, or maybe in once again. So there will be other wars, and again, a great Achilles of Greek fame, the Trojan War, Magnus Achilles, will be sent. So we need to be able to recognize this as the future passive, but we're just going to say will be sent, and then to Troy, reference to the quasi-mythological, perhaps real city in the 15th century BC, namely Trojan War fame. Then a boy, so tum just means then, so then a boy. So let's go ahead and write that down. So here we have perhaps a reference to prophecy of Christ, some interpreters have speculated. Then a boy, this clause is a little bit tricky here. Literally, remember ubi can mean where, but since we don't have a question mark here, it means when. So ubi, as is so often in Latin, words can mean many things, but in this case, it's not where, because we don't have a question mark, but probably when in terms of time. Since it's about time, and then the first sentence in this passage is also about time, namely ites, and so let's go with time here. Then a boy, so literally when, now, long, time, you, man, will be made. There will be no labors, no wars. So I did that somewhat literally because literally it kind of makes sense, but trying to get it in idiomatic English can be a little bit tricky. So then a boy, when a long period of time will have made you a man. Let me go ahead and write that down, and then I'll try to explain that. So I kept the reading somewhat literal, but the translation sounds somewhat stilted, but I think it's easier to make sense of the Latin, keeping it somewhat literal. So if we go back and look at the Latin, so then a boy, when a long period of time, or literally when now a long period of time, will have made you, so te is the accusative form of you, and then virum is the direct object, man, because that fits our second declension accusative singular. So this idea, of course, is that after years, after education, after coming of age and all the other things we associate with life, there's some process of maturation coming about, which will in turn lead to a kind of pax romana, or Roman peace, where the labors and the wars and the other things that Rome had suffered from for a long time throughout the first century, for example, are going to come to an end because of the maturity and wisdom and leadership of this boy, perhaps Caesar Augustus, or again, as some Christian writers have speculated, the advent of Christian civilization. There will be no labors, and so this is simply nulli. This is second declension nominative plural, so this actually is functioning as an adjective, so nulli labores. This is another thing that's tricky in Latin, is we have an adjective using one declension, but then the noun it's modifying is using another. Well, that cuts to the heart of Latin as an inflected language that uses cases, and so we just have to get comfortable that that's the case. Most often you'll have adjectives or nouns with the same ending or spelling, but in this case we don't. There will be no labors. There was no painful exercises or no suffering, if you will. No difficult times. Pax Romana. Roman peace. There will be no labors, no wars. So this bellum is a neuter noun. In fact, our declension chart uses bellum as the example, bellum, but since here it's in the plural because it's bella, and then nolla. There will be no labors, no wars, which again was a big deal since Rome, in one sense, was always at war. There will be no labors, no wars. Sailors will literally descend. Sailors will leave. I think this is where we can look this one up to get the right tense here. Yeah, so it is future. So because it's the third conjugation verb. So sailors will descend, in other words, leave their ship, or dismount. I'm going to say descend, to keep it somewhat literal. Sailors will descend from their ships. So sailors, nautai, will descend. Ex from, and then from their ships. Here's another good example how Latin tends not to use the possessive adjective, in this case there. But ex is always followed by the ablative. So third declension ablative plural is ibus. So if you look at our declension chart, you can see there it is, ibus right there. Ablative plural, third declension. Sailors will depart from their ships. Farmers too now, so farmers also now too will relinquent agros, will leave their fields, I guess, literally relinquish. I think I mentioned before, this is one reason I think there's not a lot of Virgil in the Wheelocks. Virgil is very, very tricky to translate, and this level of Latin without, making this a 400 level course, and looking at the original in greater detail, it's somewhat hard to excerpt from Virgil, and so we're seeing that with some of the stilted translations. But the grammar still should be fairly straightforward. So here's something like this. We should be able to recognize this as first declension nominative plural I. This is simply an adverb. Here's fields of the second declension accusative plural, os, and then here is our verb, where we get the words like relinquish or to leave. But this is where we want to be careful with our verb tenses, and also in the future. So we'll abandon, we'll leave behind. So I'm going to go with one of those. So we put it all together. Farmers also too will now leave behind their fields. So the context of here is they'll have to work less, presumably, because it's a period of prosperity. Clearly they still have to do farming in order to survive, especially back in the ancient world before the Industrial Revolution, but they'll have a period of rest or peace or pax, which will be welcome considering the difficulties that Romans had experienced in the previous decades, if not century. The earth itself will literally prepare. I mean, I wouldn't say will give, but this is, if we look this up in Whitaker's words, will prepare, will furnish, will supply, will provide, will produce, will obtain. So I'm going to go with provide for this particular one. So the earth itself will provide. So let's slow this down and just, so the earth itself, terra ipsa, will provide, and then provide everything, omnia. So let's go ahead and write that down as well. Will provide everything, and then provide everything to whom? Well, in this case, to all human beings. So if we look here, remember the dative is to or for whom something is done. So sure enough, third declension dative plural is ibus. So if we look at our chart right here, third declension dative plural is ibus because men is third declension. All right, so we're almost done here. So curete is in the imperative form. Literally means run, but in this case, hurry is probably the challenge of this. With the greatest literature, and this is why this is a tricky text to translate. You really can't translate Virgil. It's untranslatable. It's like trying to translate Shakespeare into another language. It just misses a lot of the meaning because what makes Shakespeare's genius is the English, and so it's the same with Homer, and it's the same with Virgil. It is in this case, the Latin that makes Virgil's genius. So you can see curite means run, trot, gallop, hurry, hasten, speed, move, travel. So maybe hasten, we'll go with hasten since it's a little bit more literary, which I think is the sense, but you can see it's the present active imperative. So we're going to say hasten. And then, since I'm in a literary mood, because I was thinking in literary terms, hasten ye ages. It's kind of an older way of putting it, but that's kind of the sense of the original Latin. Hasten ye ages, we talked about this as meaning time. In this case, of course, in this particular instance, notice it's in the plural. So this is age, this is ages. So hasten ye ages. And incipe means to begin, like incipient. So begin, small boy. And then begin what? Begin, small boy. Scire, where we get the word science, to know your mother. In other words, to come into the light of the world, to be born, to come into existence is the sense here. So begin, small boy. To know, so this is simply an infinitive, and then notice matram is third declension accusative singular, so that's the direct object. So scire matram. Another example of how Latin doesn't use a possessive adjective, so it doesn't have your, it just says scire matram, no mother. And eret is also future tense, so we have a lot of future tense here, and there will be is another instance where we might want to just look these things up. And this is future active, and we can't just say will be. So in English, we have to say there will be. So there is kind of a dummy subject in the English language. And there will be literally enough spirit to me to speak your deeds. So let me write that down, then I'll try to explain. And there will be once again, this last clause is a little bit wooden, but I'm trying to keep it literal in this case. Translation, once again, is a lot harder than people think because you have to make decisions. And as you can imagine, if you're not highly proficient, in other words, a professor of classics, then you probably are not going to tackle this kind of translation for publication to begin with. So let's look at the Latin here. So hasten ye ages, begin, small boy, to know your mother, in other words, to be born, and there will be satis, where we get satisfaction, like satisfactory. So here it's just being used in that sense. And then enough of what? Enough spirit. Could also mean breath in order to speak or to say something. And there will be enough spirit for me. So mihi. And then to speak, dicere, and then to speak what? your deeds to facta. So here's another example where why this passage is tricky, because we have a participle for facta. You can see, even looking it up on Whitaker's Words, probably doesn't give us a whole lot of confidence that we know how this word is being used. All right, so this is a tricky one, to be sure, one of the trickier ones in the Wheelock's Latin, and I think that just stems from Virgil's genius and just how difficult it is to translate Homer, or to translate Virgil, to translate Shakespeare, to translate literature is a little bit tricky. All right, so take a look at this. As always, let me know if you have any questions. As I will point out in my email, your test is next Wednesday. I'll make a note of that. Indy Rich, 6 o'clock. If you cannot make it, you will need to set up an appointment in the foreign language department. Again, unfortunately, given the online format, and since I'm not on campus to mediate emails and things of this nature, you'll have to set up an appointment with the foreign language department and take the test in person there. But I hope you can make it on that Wednesday. All right, valete.